In 1968, Eric von Däniken asked the ancient alien question in a book called Chariots of the Gods. It became an international bestseller, and basically ever since he has put a challenge to science to come up with an answer as to whether or not we were alone in the past. 40 years on, the answer is still open, and scientists are refusing to look at whether or not we have been visited in the past. The question is, were we alone? The question remains, were we alone? But in this DVD, I hope to really get to the point of this question and provide an answer which says, yes, we were not alone. When Eric von Däniken posed the question, various topics began to come to the forefront. One of the most famous ones were the Nazca lines. The Nazca lines are in Peru, and they are a system of lines and geoglyphs on the ground. At the time, very few people were interested. In fact, it was a lone woman called Maria Reiki who almost single-handedly was trying to get these places preserved. When Eric therefore focused his attention on the Nazca lines and asked whether these were signs of ancient aliens who might have come to planet Earth, basically pandemonium descended on her domain. When you start looking at the Nazca lines in detail, you will find that very few of them are really landing strips, as Eric posed the question. It simply cannot be. They are geoglyphs, they are inches of scraped surface which have revealed the underlying code, and as such, really are not a landing strip at all. But the basic question which Eric was asking was this: should they be seen from the sky? Should they be seen from above? Well, scientists, after Eric posed the question, began to study the Nazca lines, and what they found was that really they were part of a larger civilization, even one which had pyramids. But there was no room, of course, for an airport or an ancient space dock. But what some scientists are looking at right now is indeed this question: should they not be seen from above? Because really only from above can they be seen from the perspective that they are designed to be. And the answer is yes. There has been evidence so far which suggests that some of the scarring of the rock means that these rocks were very close to heat. And the heat has been there because of hot air balloons. In short, it's believed, and it is proposed by scientists, that the Nazca lines were indeed supposed to be seen from the sky. Not by ancient extraterrestrial beings, but by us ourselves, by our civilization, which had far more advanced knowledge, which had hot air balloons, and which, with these hot air balloons, they could see the geoglyphs from the sky. In the case of Nazca, it might appear that von Däniken has been debunked, but really what he has shown is that our ancestors were indeed far more superior, technologically speaking, than in 1968 we were giving them credit for. The other artifact which von Däniken focused on was the Palenque coffin. This is a coffin of Lord Pakal, and it's situated in a pyramid. Basically the question was, when you turn it 90 degrees around, does this not look as if Lord Pakal is riding some kind of air scooter? Of course the question is very tantalizing, but when we start looking at the Palenque tomb, we really see that we cannot just turn it 90 degrees as we want it to be. Instead, what has been identified since 1968 once again, and pretty much because of von Däniken's prodding, is that we now know that this is a scene depicting Lord Pakal descending into the underworld. He is falling into the underworld at the World Tree. So once again, von Däniken posed a question. The answer seems to be no, but in trying to answer the question, science has really found an answer to what Lord Pakal really was being symbolized at his tombstone. Out of the 237 questions which von Däniken posed, some have been proven to be a no. But it doesn't necessarily mean that in finding the answer, which is a negative, that he didn't contribute to science. Early on, people like Joseph Blumrich began to look at von Däniken's material. And Blumrich was a NASA engineer, and basically he went in search of details which he felt he could easily debunk. And so when von Däniken is talking about the description of Ezekiel and wonders whether what Ezekiel is seeing in the Bible is actually a spaceship, Blumrich felt he was right at home and was going to basically destroy von Däniken's reputation. Well, what happened next is a story which Blumrich loves telling. Basically what happened was this: Blumrich went in search of further details as to what Ezekiel had found, and basically a few years later Blumrich published a book called The Spaceship of Ezekiel. What Blumrich was finding and identifying was that everything which von Däniken said about Ezekiel he could verify and back up. And basically what he was doing was showing that von Däniken had only touched the surface, and that within the writings of Ezekiel in the Bible there were further details which highlighted the possibility that what Ezekiel had seen was indeed a spaceship. All of this to suggest that really the question which von Däniken posed in 1968 has received an awful lot of controversy, but we also need to move into broader aspects and introduce new material, because so much has changed since then, and really that needs to rise to the surface right now. The big question when it comes to the ancient alien question is whether they are a substitute for God. It's a question which an awful lot of people would really say maybe. And definitely it's a possibility, even though I personally believe that we should really disentangle the two topics. Ancient alien theorists have looked at cargo cults, and basically cargo cults are a relatively new phenomenon. What happened was this: at the time of the Second World War, southern Pacific islands got an enormous amount of American soldiers in the War of the South Pacific. And so what happened was that all of a sudden the natives of islands like Tana basically were given an awful lot of goods, and their island was transformed into a military basis. After the Second World War, everybody left. And basically the island once again felt that these people should come back. And this is where the idea of a cargo cult comes about. Because what happened next was that the runways were being reconstructed out of reed. The planes which the American soldiers had was reconstructed out of wheat. And basically a concept came about that there had been this civilizing deity which they identified with John Froome, and they really were beginning to implore him to return and bring back this golden age. And this is something which we see in an awful lot of cultures, whether it is Quetzalcoatl in the Mayan heartland, Viracocha with the Incas, Osiris with the ancient Egyptians. All of these deities which somehow brought them civilization have always been said to return, and to some extent were also implored to return, because they were going to return a golden age to the various civilizations, whether they were the Mayans, the Incans, or the ancient Egyptians. And what we're seeing is that a physical contact, a physical deity in the Southern Pacific indeed made it into a god. And there's a funny aftermath to this, because some time later, they heard stories about Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, and basically they began to work him into the mythology of this John Froome. They said he was the cousin or the brother of John Froome, and they actually began to identify him as a deity and began to send letters to him and began to consider him to be as one of their tribe, even though, of course, he has nothing to do with the people of the South Pacific. The interesting aspect is that eventually they were able to bypass royal protocol and send a letter to the Duke of Edinburgh, and basically he returned it signed with a photograph, signed as well. And the people of Vanuatu and other South Pacific islands are now worshipping Prince Philip as a deity. And it just goes you to show that indeed certain people can be deified, and certain alien people, not necessarily alien in the sense that they were extraterrestrial, but definitely that they had nothing to do with the indigenous culture as such, transformed the civilization, and once they left, really left a religious framework in place. That to some extent is what the ancient alien theory is proposing as well, that there were contact with intelligences which are either human, non-human, physical or non-physical, but definitely outside of the scope of a civilization, and that there are traces in the myths, the legends, and the stories of these civilizations which show that contact had been established with somebody alien to the indigenous tribe. So let us go into the best evidence for finding out whether or not ancient contact has been made with our ancestors. Well, we need to start with the only surviving monument of the Seven Wonders, the Great Pyramid. People will tell you that the Great Pyramid could not possibly have been built by mankind, and that is to some extent simply not true. Our ancestors were definitely capable of building it. The really intriguing question is whether they did, and whether there is evidence within the building of the Great Pyramid of signs that they were using technology which was not commonly available to them. And the answer to that question is yes. Basically, the story of the Great Pyramid is the story of a French physicist, chemist, Joseph Davidovich. He is considered to be the father of geopolymerization. And basically, geopolymers is the following thing. The science of geopolymerization is that Davidovich was looking to natural rocks and basically realized that these were formed over a certain period of time, from days to sometimes millennia to sometimes millions of years. It's a chemical process, and so he wondered whether if he used the same ingredients he could use chemical processes to speed up the rock formation and basically do this in his laboratory. And so he set out to find out whether he could do that, and the answer was a positive. He managed to do so, hence why he became the father of geopolymerization. He has a record, as curriculum vitae, which is longer than most books, but a few years ago he basically began to see that what was happening in ancient Egypt was very much on par with what he had seen in his laboratory. When Davidovich looked at the blocks of the Great Pyramid, he realized that they had not been hewn from a quarry. He realized that they were the result of geopolymerization, that they were geopolymers. And so what he did was he began to do a detailed investigation. And when he felt that he was ready to publish it, he also made the Egyptologists aware. What happened next was something of a farcical comedy, because Egyptologists basically said that they knew that what Davidovich was saying was simply not true. The Great Pyramid was not made from cement, because geopolymers in Egyptological circles are quite often mistaken for cement, and it's clearly not the case. Cement is cement, geopolymers are natural rocks, but just through a speeded up process. And so what he did was that he sent in a piece of geopolymer for chemical analysis, and the laboratories which the Egyptological circles use sent back a report saying that it was a natural rock, to which his reply was, well, that's not the case. It is a piece of rock which I created in my laboratory, and it goes to show that your analysis of my research is basically incorrect. Where it stands at the moment is that Davidovich is slowly beginning to get ahead in convincing Egyptological circles of his right. But the interesting thing is this: Davidovich is showing us that a process which was only discovered in the 1970s was also in use in the ancient Egyptian times, and then disappeared. The interesting aspect is that from ancient Egyptian times we have records which show us that they knew who was responsible for pyramid building processes. His name is Imhotep, and he really was deified by the ancient Egyptians themselves. Imhotep says that the knowledge through which he was able to construct pyramids was given to him by non-human intelligences. And so we have clear evidence to suggest that the ancient Egyptians were indeed right in saying that they were not alone, that they were guided on this process of civilization. And the Great Pyramid is just one example as to how they were guided in this process along the lines of deities, non-human intelligences helping them out. Another favorite place of mine is Baalbek in the Bekaa Valley in the Lebanon. It's not hot on the tourist list right now, basically because it is in such a volatile region. Baalbek is composed of a temple of Jupiter, which was built in Roman times, and it is actually the largest Roman temple outside of Rome. When you are asking historians as to how the ancient Romans built this temple, they will tell you that that moment in time they really were stretched in their technical capabilities in constructing this temple. But it's not the temple, but the platform on which the temple sits that is the enigma. Here we find stone blocks which are thousands of tons in weight. In fact, the tallest one, the largest one, weighs just under 2,000 tons. At the end of the 20th century, construction engineers were able to work with such weights. There were machines which could lift this amount of weight, but there were no machines 10 years ago which could transport this weight. Yet we know for a fact that the engineers of Baalbek thousands of years ago were able to transport this. Now, how are historians dealing with this anomaly? They're basically leaving it unaddressed, as if there is no problem there. But clearly, when we have only just gotten the technology to move these stones into place, and we know for a fact that the ancient engineers of Baalbek were able to transport this, then there is a question to be answered there. Karnak in Brittany is another famous example. Here we have thousands of standing stones aligned in neat rows. We are unable to really give any insights as to what they were there for. Karnak is part of the megalithic civilization, and this is how far as science has gone. They have identified that the people who built these stones were people who built these stones, because a megalith really is a tall stone. Well, in the case of Karnak, there are explorations as to what these might all be about. First of all, they have been identified as being aligned to things like the summer solstice, the winter solstice, the equinoxes, to certain important standstills of the moon. So we know for a fact that there was some kind of technical capability in constructing these. It is thanks to the work of Howard Crowhurst, who really has gone into an extraordinary detail into Carnac, that we begin to identify certain components. First of all, he's been able to identify that an awful lot of mathematical skill went into these things. That these stones were not just simply placed haphazardly, but that they were really placed according to a mathematical sequence. Furthermore, that the distances and the alignments of the various megalithic rows in Carnac also were not just done by coincidence, but that they were done in a very specific pattern. So what we're getting here is thousands of stones which were aligned in very specific rows, but for which science has not found an answer. But what we do know is that there was extraordinary amounts of engineering in these stone rows. And this is to some extent another example of where we find that our ancestors were far more technically capable, but also mathematically aware than we give them credit for. For example, such things as pi and phi did not officially exist in megalithic times. The discovery of these mathematical equations are only credited to the Greeks. But we find that the megalith builders of Carnac were definitely aware of them. So what we see here really is once again an example of a fact that science is unable to address something which is physically present. And it is once again a question for science as to how they are going to explain this. Now, in the case of Carnac, the question remains whether this is an ancient alien connection or whether it is more a lost civilization connection. And to some extent, at this moment in time, that question has to remain open. One of the gimmicks of the ancient alien theory has to be crystal skulls. The crystal skulls are awe-inspiring, and nobody really knows how they were made. Well, we can reproduce them today, but not necessarily all skulls. Some of them stand out, and two stand out more than others. One of them is Max. Max is a crystal skull which is composed out of 6 different types of crystal. And it is said that whoever began to work with this crystal, if we were to do it today, basically Max would shatter into thousands of pieces. But somehow in the past somebody has been able to form Max, and the end result is still there. Max, unfortunately, is not as famous as the Mitchell-Hedges skull. The Mitchell-Hedges skull is one of the very few ancient skulls which has a detachable jaw. When Anna Mitchell-Hedges took her skull to Hewlett-Packard Laboratories, they identified that really this was a piece of engineering which today we cannot do. The problem is that the jaw is made of the same piece of crystal, and so for that to work, really we need to identify a piece of technology which we currently do not have, because every piece of technology today is unable to reproduce this. It is said that it would shatter, but basically we have no idea how to do this. HP said that if it was done through human work, it would really have taken 75 years, probably 3 people, each 20 years to do this, day in, day out, to get this end result. It is really impossible to believe that this was the case. Now, the Mitchell-Hedges skull has also come in for some scrutiny and for some skepticism. Jane Walsh of the Smithsonian is absolutely convinced that the Mitchell-Hedges skull was made at the end of the 19th century in Germany. Fortunately or unfortunately, she has been unable to produce any evidence to back up her conclusion, however vociferous she is in proclaiming it. It is true that there is some controversy as to where Mitchell-Hedges got his crystal skull from. The story goes that Anna Mitchell-Hedges, on the 1st of January 1917, her 17th birthday, that she identified the skull amongst other pieces in the ruins of a Mayan citadel. There is no archaeological evidence to back that up. It is even said that she probably wasn't there. But this doesn't necessarily mean that the skull is indeed of origins from Germany or elsewhere, that this is a modern fake. In fact, the answer can be found in White Tiger, which is a book which Mitchell Hedges wrote as a novel. But many aspects of the novel really show that what he's doing here is putting out non-fiction under the guise of fiction. And basically the story of White Tiger is this. An English expat is living in Mexico and comes across a tribe. The tribe takes him in, and after a period of time begins him to show secrets. Part of these secrets involve a huge treasure. And in White Tiger, which is the nickname of this English expat, after a while, White Tiger goes with the high priest into the vault which is said to contain the treasure of the Aztecs. And after a series of pushing against walls revealing doors, he finally sees in front of him the treasure of the Aztecs. And in it, he says, are crystal heads. Now, Mitchell Hedges writes this book in 1931. And it's only 1947-ish that he begins to take the crystal skull out for public displays. And really, when you reconstruct Mitchell Hedges' life, you begin to realize that indeed there is a period of his time, 1912, 1914, that he was living the life of White Tiger, that he was making contact with these indigenous tribes, and that it is likely that it is at that moment in time that he was given the crystal skull for preservation. After a few decades, he really felt confident enough to take it out on the road and show it to people. It appears that because it was such a mysterious circumstance, such a privileged circumstance in which he was given these crystal skulls, that Anna Mitchell Hedges then invented the story as to how she discovered it. Because if the story of White Tiger is true, then it is not just one crystal skull which Mitchell Hedges has. There were really several crystal skulls still hiding, probably to this day, together with other treasures of the Mayan population somewhere within the Mayan heartland. And so a white lie was invented basically to protect the people from that region against treasure seekers. One of the best examples has to come from the Bible, and it is the story of the Watchers. In Genesis itself, it says that non-human beings came down to earth and began to mate with females. The end result was a race of giants, but also that the creatures which were born were so big that quite often the women could not give birth to it because basically the pelvis was not wide enough for the heads of these creatures. Now, that might sound a lot like science fiction, but why would it make it into Genesis? What if it is a religious message? What is the religious message really there for? And when you start looking into the archaeological evidence, you will find that this is actually not something which is typical to the Bible. It is actually a tradition which dates back to Sumerian times. And what we have are stories of the Nephilim, other creatures which are said to have descended from heaven to earth to mate with mankind. And so what we see is evidence from various cultures, but present in the Western Bible as well, which shows that so many traditions in the Middle East had a clear knowledge and belief that they at one point had been visited. This is not just something which can be pushed aside, because there is also archaeological evidence in various locations, in fact on various continents, to show that there seems to be a race of giants. Giant skulls were found, for example, in Lovelock, Nevada. And it shows you that the giants which were described in the Bible are not just stories, are not just myths, but are also archaeological. They have left a trace in our archaeological records. And it is really up to us to begin to analyze whether or not all of these interrelate, whether these giants on the New World were linked with the giants on the Old World, and whether indeed they are of non-human origins, or whether they are a sort of lost species of planet Earth. Now, what is the best evidence? And the best evidence, according to Carl Sagan, is actually a story of Oannes. The story of Ioannis is very interesting, and it is recorded by Berossus. Berossus is a person who lived in Greek times and who was reporting on events which took place in Babylonian times. The story of Ioannis is this, that a creature which was half fish, half man, came from the Persian Gulf and began to speak, if not instruct, with the locals. He taught them sciences such as astronomy, mathematics. At night he would disappear once again into the Persian Gulf, and the next morning, or a few days later, he would emerge from there again and continue his education. After a certain period of time, Ioannis would stop coming, and a little while later, somebody else would come, another creature, half fish, half man. And that creature knew precisely where Ioannis had left off, and he took it up from there. This continued for a series of 7 such creatures, which in the Babylonian tradition and in the Sumerian tradition are known as the Apkallu, the 7 sages who basically brought civilization to the Babylonians and to the Sumerians. So what we have here is very clear evidence that the Babylonians say that civilization was a gift of the gods, that it was a non-human intelligence, a half fish, half man, a creature called Ioannis, who gave it to them. That they were taught civilization, that civilization was a gift of the gods. This story of Ioannis was actually identified by the late Carl Sagan as the best evidence available that we have been contacted in the past by non-human intelligences, which were clearly in this case in a physical form, and clearly of a description which makes them very much a candidate for being of extraterrestrial origins. The dropper, as they're called, are believed to have been the result of a spacecraft which crashed in 12,000 BC. Now, really this sounds an extraordinary story, doesn't it? And the story goes as this. In 1962, a Chinese scientist was able to decode inscriptions which had been found during a scientific expedition in the 1920s. And what he said he identified in these inscriptions was that a spacecraft had indeed landed in 12,000 BC, that it had made contact with the local people, and that a second spacecraft a few thousand years later had also crashed in that region. The survivors of that spacecraft basically settled and began to interbreed with locals. Now, the first question is, of course, is it possible that an extraterrestrial civilization can interbreed with mankind? And it is something which we'll come back to. But let's assume for the moment that the answer is yes. Well, the story then continues that the end result was a human being which looked human but with certain specific features, specifically very strong bones of the head with deep inset eyes. The story of the dropper might remain there had it not been for the work of a German tour operator called Hartwig Hausdorff. And in the early 1990s he was able to go into China and speak to the people involved. And what he came back with was a story that really confirms everything of the original account. What he identified was that the jade discs on which these inscriptions had been found do exist. In fact, jade discs are quite common. The story, of course, has not been verified, but here is what we know. We know that in 1997, the Chinese government began to do a detailed study. They were basically mapping everybody in China and identifying tribes. The end result is that in the land near where the dropper were said to have crashed, there were evidences there of tribes which were very different from anywhere else in China. The features which they describe are very much on par with the descriptions of the dropper. And of course, Chinese scientists since 1997 have been trying to explain as to why this tribe looks so strange. Their explanation is that really what had happened there is that some form of contamination, maybe lead poisoning, in the past was the contributing factor as to why these people look so weird. But really other scientists have been able to say that this is simply not the case. Lead poisoning kills people, it doesn't cause genetic mutations or genetic transformations. So whatever these people are, they are indeed posing an anomaly, and scientists in China are actually trying to explore that mystery as we speak. Now, the problem with the Chinese Roswell is that some people believe this is a hoax. They say that David Agamemnon in Sun Gods in Exile in 1978 wrote this book which he pretended was non-fiction. It's a story about an archaeologist who in 1947 goes on an expedition into the Bayan Kara-Ula homeland and stumbles upon verification of the story of the stone discs of Bayan Kara-Ula. Later on, David Agamemnon basically said that this was an invention, that he had dressed up fiction as non-fiction. Certain people believe that the Chinese Roswell is a myth, that it has been debunked. They argue that a book in 1978 called Sun Gods in Exile is responsible for this myth. Indeed, Sun God in Exile was published in 1978 and uses the material of the stone discs of Bayan Kara-Ula, and it injects the story of an expedition in 1947. A person basically goes to the Bayan Kara-Ula region and finds corroborating evidence for the stone discs and the space crash story. David Agamemnon, who wrote this book, afterwards said that even though the book pretended to be non-fiction, he had largely made it up. And so skeptics are pointing out that the entire story of the Chinese Roswell goes back to this story of 1978, and that therefore we should simply discard it. Unfortunately, that's absolutely not the case. Hartwig Hausdorff and various other people have been able to identify that the story goes back to 1962. They have found evidence in 1962 newspapers in Germany which relate the story, 16 years before Sun God in Exile was published. 1962 is also the time when, of course, the Chinese professor was said to have made this discovery, this breakthrough. And so the question really should be asked is this: did in 1962 this professor indeed make this breakthrough, and was this somehow reported into West German magazines at that moment? The answer seems to be a straightforward yes. The question is, of course, where these stone discs are and what happened to these Chinese professors. That is something which is there for the future. But once again, all the evidence which we are exploring when it comes to the Chinese Roswell, each case, the evidence is suggesting that it is true, that something happened. And we have people living there right now, descendants of the dropper, who we can go and get DNA from and really answer the question as to whether or not these people were indeed human, non-human intelligences, hybrids. So we have various pockets of information from the archaeological, mythological, historical framework. And really the question then is, can we extrapolate from this? Are there big theories which we can substantiate? Do we know where ET came from? Do we know what they did in the past? Certain people like David Icke, Zechariah Sitchin, others have said, yes, we can. One specific person, Robert Temple, wrote about the Dogon tribe who live in Mali. He basically said that when he analyzed his findings on this tribe, that they were an example of a tribe who had contact with an extraterrestrial intelligence. He believed that they possessed information about Sirius A, B, and C, which they couldn't have gathered through normal means. He basically argued that they had been given this information through contact with non-human intelligences. ET had told them this. Now, when other scientists, and specifically anthropologists, made contact with the Dogon tribe, what they identified was that the information which Temple presented was really not as strong as it should be. The people who the anthropologists, specifically Griol and Dieterlen, spoke to in the early part of the 20th century, some of them were still alive, And they basically said that the anthropologists had mistaken or misidentified some of the information which the tribe elders had given to them. Now, when it comes to Sitchin, it is an entirely different matter. Sitchin will tell you that he perfectly knows where the ancient aliens came from. He says that they come from a planet called Nibiru, which he identifies as the 12th planet in our solar system. He says that Nibiru has a very specific orbit, that its orbit really is 3,600 years, and that the planet is sometimes close to the Sun and sometimes very far from the Sun. He says that these people came to planet Earth to get gold, which they needed, their home planet, and also that they created mankind specifically as a slave labor force to work in the gold mines, specifically the gold mines of Africa, specifically of South Africa. He also believes that this contact was established several hundreds of thousands of years ago. The problem with Sitchin is this. Sitchin in the 1970s was saying that everybody else was mistranslating Sumerian languages, that he alone was able to understand and read Sumerian, and that therefore we should stick with his interpretation of the Sumerian language. What Sitchin is failing to say is that really the ancient Sumerians had a lexicon. We today have a lexicon of Sumerian words, which basically means that we can go and check specifically a Sumerian word and what they mean. That there is a definition left to us by the ancient Sumerians. And so the words that Sitchin is highlighting, for example Mu or Shem, which he interprets as a spaceship or a spacecraft, really are no such thing. It is a completely different meaning, which the ancient Sumerians gave to these words themselves. So we know that Sitchin is definitely somewhat wrong. But specifically what I felt was really upsetting was that when I started to fact-check some of Sitchin's claims. For example, I was very personally interested in a story about how certain glass remains in the Sinai Desert could potentially be evidence of an ancient explosion. Sitchin was talking about this, and I felt that I should really explore this, because if this were the case, it would be amongst the best evidences. Because we all know that atomic warfare and atomic explosion could only mean one thing: a high technologically advanced civilization which either completely disappeared, or an extraterrestrial incident, an extraterrestrial encounter. And what we know, that there are Sumerian accounts such as the one of Owanis, which is after all one of the best examples of contact with a non-human intelligence, I felt that I had to explore. Well, Sitchin in one of his books basically says that there is a scientific publication which details these glass remains in the Sinai Desert. And he says that the paper clearly identifies that nobody knows how this happened, and that it is unexplainable to some extent. Fortunately, the scientific paper was available on the internet, so I had an easy download, and even in the summary it is clear that a completely different picture emerges than the one which Sitchin is painting. The scientific paper basically says that this material comes from a volcanic explosion. And so whereas Sitchin is saying and making us believe that there is no information whatsoever as to how this glass material came about, scientific paper makes it very clear that this is the result of a volcanic explosion. The only question which the scientific paper leaves is that it is unable as to which specific explosion out of 3 potential candidates this glass material has originated from. So I'm somewhat, if not extremely upset with Sitchin, because there is no possible means that he could have misinterpreted this summary. And all of his other evidence really does suggest that his theories is just that. It's a theory. And when we start digging deeper, really what we are finding are holes. So at this moment in time, the ancient alien question really does not have an answer which is all-encompassing. There is substantial evidence out there which suggests that our ancestors were indeed in contact with extraterrestrial beings. They themselves believe so, so it is definitely not derogatory to think that some of our civilizations were not just simply due to our ancestors, but due to outside factors. But the question is, are we as a species extraterrestrials ourselves? really, a very interesting example of alien life came about during the research phase of the ancient alien question. We seem to be aliens ourselves. Chandra Wickramasinghe is a professor who studied under Sir Fred Hoyle, and basically what he is saying is that since 1982 there has been a conspiracy of silence to squash any dissent which argues that life has originated on planet Earth. He's saying that since 1982 there is actually a substantial amount of evidence that life has originated elsewhere in the universe, and in fact that there is evidence to suggest that life could not possibly have originated on planet Earth. This somehow primordial soup which is deemed to be responsible for the origins of life on Earth do not wash, and there are experiments dating back to the 19th century which show as such. Now, since 1982, Wickramasinghe is saying that viruses are most potentially also of extraterrestrial origin. But the big focus has been on NASA. In 1996, they went public with evidence that there was life on a meteorite from Mars. And in December 2010, they also helped a professor called Wolf Simon in her proclamation of evidence, really alien evidence. And in December of 2010, NASA also helped Wolf Simon publish her accounts as to how in Mono Lake she has found evidence of a life form which defies everything we understand life on planet Earth to be. She's not saying it is alien life, but it is really alien in the sense that it is so weird. Now, NASA is very close to finding evidence of extraterrestrial life. They feel confident that within the next 15 to 20 years they will do so. NASA was trying to pick up signs of intelligence life on radio astronomy with SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Life. Today, they have changed tack. They believe that astrobiology is actually the best means of identifying life on planets outside the solar system. For this, they have launched things like the Kepler telescope. And when it was launched in 2010, a year later, by February 2011, they have already identified 54 planets on which they suspect that further exploration of those systems will identify life. So 15 to 20 years is really very close. But NASA has gone further. In their laboratories, they have actually recreated interstellar space. And when they did so, they found that the building blocks of life, DNA and RNA, are spontaneously being created there. They have gone as far as to say that life in the universe is a cosmic imperative. The conclusions which NASA is revealing suggest that life in the universe is everywhere, and that this life is very much like ours. It is DNA based. And so whenever we are confronted with stories from myths and legends that somehow our ancestors were able to interbreed with non-human intelligences, ancient aliens, we should really be looking towards the very latest research coming from within NASA to suggest that this is indeed absolutely possible. NASA is currently paving the way to identify that our ancient myths are absolutely true. So we're being confronted with, on the one side, NASA, who's helping us answer the ancient alien question. They are confident that within the next 15 years or so, they are going to find evidence of alien life somewhere outside of this planet. They're showing us that DNA is a cosmic imperative. And when we look at the archaeological record, there are clear signs that ancient aliens are not a figment of our imagination, or maybe our ancestors' imagination, but that they are genuine possibilities. On the other hand, we have science who's basically refusing to address the issue. Now, when it comes to the possibility of ancient alien contact with our ancestors, Duncan Loonan, a Scottish astronomer, made a statistical analysis. And he is showing us that in the period of time from roughly 5000 BC to now, there should be 3 or 4 potential contacts with our ancestors of ancient aliens. 3 or 4. So out of 240 questions which Eric von Däniken posed, out of the various potentials, whether they are crystal skulls, whether they are the evidence of Baalbek, and specifically the story of Oannes, only 3 or 4 need to be true. All the other ones are likely going to be discarded as either evidence of a higher civilization which was present on Earth but which was human in origins, or simply as something else. 3 or 4 is really something which we're aiming for. Nothing more, nothing less. Now, a glimmer of hope on the horizon has come from Paul Davies. He is arguing that the ancient alien theory, the ancient alien question, should be reframed as a science called astroforensics. It is his conviction that astroforensics should go out and study DNA, should study the geological record, should study stars, should study everything within the archaeological world, and look for evidence of contact with a non-human alien intelligence. He is of the opinion that contact with this alien intelligence did not occur within the possibility of the last 5,000 years. He is of the conviction that ancient aliens might have been on planet Earth, but that this happened somehow hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years, maybe even billions of years. But it is clear when we look at the archaeological record and the mythological record that all our ancestors were screaming it at an extremely loud voice, and that voice was this: we were not alone. We were not alone on the road of civilization. We walked the path of civilization, and we were guided on this path by a non-human intelligence. Whether you want to call this a physical alien being or whether you would want to call it something else, it doesn't really matter. The examples are there. Now, to understand this idea of ancient alien contact, we actually need to go into the present times as well. And it is here where I understood that stories like Imhotep, who says that he found information about how to build the pyramids from a non-human intelligence, also has components in our today's reality. Probably the most famous example of this is Terence McKenna. Terence McKenna was an anthropologist who went into the Amazon rainforest. He partook of a potion called ayahuasca, which he said opened his mind, projected his mind into another dimension, and in that other dimension he made contact with non-human intelligences. He said that they gave him a piece of information which was the fabric of time, how time was constructed, and how the fabric of time really was a fractal wave. They gave him a mathematical formula, and he brought this mathematical formula with him from this other dimension into our present reality. And for approximately 30 years, he subjected this to analysis, gave it to people for various experimentations with them. They were made into computer programs. It was believed that novelty, new things, was somehow related to this concept of time. And he also believed that time at some point was going to run out. Now, Terence McKenna's example of time wave zero, or the time wave, or whatever you want to call it, this fractal wave, this mathematical equation, is really very good evidence of a non-human intelligence giving mankind information. And so we see that this is not just happening in the past, but also in the present. And so I think we have to distinguish as well when we are defining ancient aliens. When von Däniken posed the question in the 1960s, very much the question on everybody's mind was whether a physical ET came here and gave us information. And the story of Oannes is clearly an example of where this is likely the case. Duncan Lunan says that there are 3 to 4 of such potential contacts in the history of our civilization, but not more. But when we are talking about non-human contact, somehow us being able to make contact with a non-human intelligence through psychological, spiritual, or whatever means possible, really what we're seeing there is an entirely different playing field. Terence McKenna is one of them, but examples like George Van Tassel, who was a UFO contactee and who said that he was given information about acoustics from these extraterrestrial, these non-human intelligences, is another example of something which I think really breaks the field of ancient aliens wide open. If somehow we were able to identify whether or not there is a science of the soul, whether spirit really exists and whether spirit is able to communicate with spirit through telepathy, when those questions get answered, the ancient alien question will be transformed in a completely different bailiwick. And really, once again, we are waiting for science to catch up, because all of those areas of expertise are once again areas where science is not going. And so the ancient alien question, what is the answer? The answer is yes. If your burden of proof is reasonable, then the answer to the ancient alien question is yes. We have been contacted in the past. We have been contacted in the not too distant past. Terence McKenna is an example of this. However, if you put your burden of proof extremely high, you will have to conclude that the answer is no. And specifically, you are able to do so because science is helping you in escaping the positive answer. But really, when you weigh all the evidence, there is only one conclusion which we can draw. And that one is that we were not alone.